Hello and welcome to Sir Astro's Painting. In this video I'll be painting the beautiful C-3PO miniature that comes in the Yub Nub Squad Pack from the Star Wars Shatterpoint Miniatures game by Atomic Mass Games. In Star Wars Shatterpoint, both C-3PO and R2-D2 operate as a single unit on the one base, and I'll be sharing details of my approach to painting R2 in a future guide. For C-3PO, I'm going to be exploring some non-metallic metal techniques to capture his look from the movies as closely as I can, specifically his appearance in Episode 6 on Endor. I've mounted him to a temporary base for now, and as usual you can see that I primed the figure in black, followed with some zenithal highlights applied from above with the airbrush. I also decided to paint the temporary base with some dark browns and greens just to kill the white, and help me better judge the overall ambience and relative levels whilst I work. We will of course be looking at the final basing process towards the end of the video. And finally, before painting the metalwork, I'm simply using some thinned black to paint the waist area. Let's now take a look at the initial palette of colours I've chosen to use for the non-metallic metal effects. I'm starting with a nice dark shadow tone, using a mix of burnt umber and earth green. I want this to have quite an earthy tone to help capture the forest ambience that I'm after. I'll then be adding some yellow ochre to create some more golden coloured midtones. As we move into the highlights, I'm going to use some pale skin tones, golden flesh and light skin, as I don't want things to become too yellow. For some of the brighter highlights, I'm going to shift into some cooler tones with the addition of colours like pearl grey and sky blue to capture the sky tones reflected in the metal. And we'll also need some pure white to help control the levels and saturation. It's worth mentioning that you don't have to use these exact colours of course, and it's the ideas behind my choices that I really want to get across. And do bear in mind that I've tailored the palette to create a very specific ambience, and will be adding a couple more colours as I go. If I wanted to show 3PO on Tatooine for example, I'd be using quite a different set of colours. I'm going to begin by applying a fairly thinned mix of the burnt umber and earth green. I'll be differentiating the silver right leg when we come to adding the highlights there later on. I don't need this to be fully opaque and ended up applying this in a couple of layers. Here's how he looks once dry. I'm now mixing in some yellow ochre and beginning to build up the midtones. Although 3PO is pretty shiny, he also has a gently textured and weathered finish, so we can get away with a nice bit of stippling here. Here I'm beginning to map out where I want some little reflections caused by nearby parts of the suit. I'm going to focus on the legs for now to check that I'm happy with my colour choices before painting the rest. I'm now mixing in my pale skin tones and beginning to place my highlights, starting with the more prominent glints. I want the paint to be fairly opaque for this. Here I want to create the impression of the legs reflecting light onto one another. We can also increase the depth of the shadow tone where needed to maximise the contrast. This is now basically just a pale skin tone. At this point I decided to incorporate some moss green into the mid-tone colours to create a bit more of a greenish cast for some of the shadows and mid-tones. This can be applied in a non-uniform way to create little fluctuations of tone, and throughout the painting process I'm going to be looking for ways of introducing small shifts and nuances of colour like this. And I'm now continuing to add some additional reflective highlights, often running in thin strips in line with the cylindrical volumes. I'm now adding some brighter highlights still by mixing in some white and the purplish pearl grey, which gives us a slightly cooler tone. It's important that we don't max out every single highlight, of course, so here you can see me focusing in on some of the more prominent or upturned areas. At this point I decided I wanted to boost the saturation of the warmer tones for certain areas, so I'm mixing some burnt skin with the yellow ochre and applying it like a heavy glaze to a couple of places, such as here on the inner thigh. I'm beginning to feel pretty happy with how things are looking, so I'm now moving on to the upper body. It's the chest and head that are going to have the largest areas of highlight. I can't overstate how useful it can be to study stills from the movie to get a good sense of the highlight strength and placement. Once again, we don't need an especially smooth finish. We can enjoy some quite sketchy and organic looking highlights for large areas like this. Just as with the legs, you can now see me glazing some warmer colours on to bring up the saturation for some of the midtones. Here I'm using pure pearl grey to place some cooler highlights on the chest area. And I'm now creating a more bluish tone by mixing some sky blue and some white with a little of the golden flesh. It's by modulating the hue like this as we move up through the highlights that I find really helps to sell the metallic effect. Although it's a little sketchy in places, the metal is starting to look fairly convincing. Before going any further, I'm now going to paint the eyes using pure white. I'm then using black to place the dot in the centre of each. It took me a couple of attempts and some tidying up with the surrounding white before I reached something that looked passable. And I'm glazing over the eyes using some orange pigments thinned with some matte varnish. Pretty much any thinned orange would be fine here. I'm now continuing to work on the metal, pushing the highlights in some places and playing with the blends and the midtones in others. Next I'm going to highlight the silver leg using pretty much the same colours except without the yellow ochre, and I'll be leaning a little more into the blue. I'm now continuing to play around a little with the saturation and some additional highlights elsewhere on the model. You can see I've included a few small, fairly random specular glints here on the head. Next I'm going to paint the exposed cables on the torso using some blue, red, yellow and grey. And to add a little more variation and luminosity, I decided to glaze a few very light patches of turquoise blue into some of the transitions between midtone and highlight, mainly on the chest and head. Again, the aim here is just to create a subtly shifting pattern of tones across the surface of the metal to help sell the illusion of reflectivity. I'm now gluing both of the droids down onto the final base with some superglue. And I'm going to add a few pieces of resin plants by Epic Basing. These could be superglued into place now or after applying some basing paste. I decided to first apply some basing paste by Vallejo. I then just placed my plants along with a few bits of rocky scatter directly into the wet paste. Once that's completely dry, I'm going to brush on a black primer thinned with some hobby colour thinner. I'm now painting the base using a range of browns and greens, along with some titanium grey for the rocks and some lighter tones for the highlights. I ended up doing quite a bit of overbrushing to bring the levels up. I then shaded things back down with some Agrax Earthshade and Athonian Camoshade. And I also decided to glue down a few tufts of grass and some shrubs by Gamer's Grass. I'm now returning to add a few final refinements to the metal. And here I'm adding the greyish reflection of his nearby companion. And this completes C-3PO. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed watching me paint this beloved character as much as I enjoyed working on him. As always, you can find full paint and product lists in the video description, along with links to all of the places I can be found on social media. My sincerest thanks go to my amazing patrons for funding this work. If you'd like to support what I do, feel free to hit the Patreon link and pledge what you can. Join me again soon, and happy painting!